My mother was smiling when I opened the door. That was the first thing I noticed. Not that she was there after 37 months of nothing. Not that my father was standing a half step behind her like he always stood when he didn't want to be somewhere. Shoulders slightly inward, eyes already looking for an exit. No, the first thing I noticed was the smile. It was the same smile she'd worn at every Thanksgiving table, every school play, every parent-teacher conference where she'd leaned forward and said things like, "Elise has always been our steady one." The smile that asked for nothing and promised everything and delivered neither. I'm going to tell you what happened in that apartment. I'm going to tell you the question I asked, and I'm going to tell you what her face did when I asked it. But first I need to go back, because a question that breaks something open doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from a very specific place, and mine came from 37 months of silence that I had spent learning to live inside. Let me start with the afternoon she showed up. I had just come off a 12-hour shift in the ICU at St. Vincent's. My badge was still clipped to my scrubs. I hadn't eaten since 6 in the morning. I was standing at my kitchen counter, heating up the last of Tuesday's soup, when the doorbell rang, and I walked to the door the way I always walk to the door, checking the peephole first, a habit I'd picked up years ago that I'd never bothered to examine too closely. There was a version of my life where I would have opened that door without looking. That version of me no longer existed. I looked through the peephole. My mother was standing in the hallway outside my apartment with a canvas tote bag over one arm and the kind of expression that people wear when they're about to ask for something they've already decided they deserve. I know that expression. I've seen it on patients' family members who show up after years of absence and expect the nursing staff to brief them like they're the ones who've been there every day. The expression of someone arriving late who still expects a good seat. I stood at the door for a long moment. My hand was on the knob. The soup was still on the stove. Then I counted to 10, which is something I'd learned to do in nursing school for a different reason entirely, and I opened the door. Elise. My mother said my name the way you say the name of a city you haven't visited in a long time. Familiar. Slightly foreign. Carrying some old version of itself that may no longer exist. She stepped forward, and for one suspended second I thought she might hug me. She didn't. She moved past me into the apartment, looking around with the particular alertness of someone cataloging the room. "It's nice," she said. "It's really nice, Elise." That was the first thing she said to me after 37 months. Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "I've been thinking about you." Not, "Can we sit down and talk about what happened?" The first thing was an appraisal of my square footage. My father followed her in. Frank Bellamy had the look of a man who had long ago surrendered the responsibility of having opinions. He nodded at me once, a single downward motion, and then he found the armchair nearest the window and sat down in it like he was lowering himself into a foxhole. I closed the door. I didn't offer them coffee. I didn't ask how the drive was. I went to the kitchen and turned off the stove, and then I stood there for a moment with my hands flat on the counter, looking at the single bowl I'd set out. Just one. The muscle memory of living alone, which I had now been doing long enough that it no longer required any thought at all. One bowl. One mug. One set of footsteps in the apartment in the morning. I'd built a life that fit exactly one person, and it fit well, and I was not going to apologize for that. I picked up my water glass and walked back to the living room. My mother had arranged herself on the sofa, with the tote bag set neatly beside her, hands folded in her lap. She had the posture of a woman preparing to speak at a meeting she has already decided the outcome of. "We need to talk to you about something," she said. I sat down across from her. I didn't say anything. "You know Amber's birthday is coming up." She paused, a brief flicker, as if considering whether to preface this differently. She decided not to. "She's been going through a really wonderful period in her life, and we thought your father and I thought that we'd like to do something significant for her. Something she'll always remember. Amber." My younger sister, 27 years old, who had been living in a way that could most charitably be described as generously supported. I knew the outline of Amber's life, the way you know the outline of a story you've been told about but never witnessed directly. The apartment downtown, the vacations, the car that appeared last spring in her Instagram photos with the caption that read like a thank you speech. I had not spoken to Amber in the same 37 months I had not spoken to my parents. This was not a coincidence. I had simply understood at a certain point that the distance was not something that had happened to me, but something that had been arranged for me, and that the arrangement included all of them. We were thinking, my mother continued, and her voice was still warm, still carrying that Thanksgiving table smoothness, $50,000, to help her really celebrate this chapter. You've always been the responsible one, Elise. You've always been so good with money, so stable. We thought you might be able to contribute. The room was quiet. Outside my window, 3 floors down, someone was dragging a recycling bin across the parking lot. A car passed. A dog, somewhere below, barked once and stopped. I got up from my chair. I went to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, though I wasn't thirsty, and I stood at the sink for a moment looking at the parking lot through the window above it. The afternoon light was doing something particular to the pavement, flattening it, washing out the color. I thought about the 12-hour shift I'd just come off. The woman in bed 7 who had looked at me this morning with eyes that were asking a question her family hadn't been able to ask for themselves. I thought about the drive home, the 15 minutes of radio before I turned it off because the quiet was better. There was something I needed to know before I said anything. So I went back to the living room. I sat down. I looked at my mother, and I asked, but to understand what I asked, and why it ended the way it ended, why my mother's face did what it did, and why the 3 of us sat in silence for a long moment that felt like a building settling, you need to understand what happened in the 37 months before that afternoon. You need to understand what silence actually sounds like when you live inside it. You need to understand a man named Calvin Bellamy, who lived in room 14 of Sunrise Pines and played chess badly, and never once made me a promise he didn't keep. Not because he made many promises, but because he made almost none at all. Let me take you back to the beginning. Let me tell you about 37 months. The last real conversation I had with my mother before that Saturday afternoon was at a wedding. Not my wedding, a friend's, Dana, who I'd known since nursing school, who had rented out a vineyard 2 hours outside of Carver Falls and filled it with people she loved. My parents were there because Dana's mother and my mother had been in the same book club for 11 years. I remember thinking, when I saw them across the venue, that it was strange how a person can exist comfortably in every part of your life, except the parts that actually matter. My mother found me near the appetizer table between the ceremony and the reception. She was wearing a blue dress that she'd had for years, and always brought out for occasions she'd already decided the correct feeling for. She looked at what I was wearing, a green dress I'd bought specifically for that day, one I'd been happy about when I looked in the mirror that morning, and she said, loudly enough for the 2 women standing beside us to hear, "That color's interesting on you, Elise. It takes someone confident to wear something like that." There was a pause that belonged to everyone in earshot. I smiled. I said thank you. I moved to the other side of the table. That was not the moment things broke. Things had been breaking for a long time. But that was the moment I stopped reaching across the gap. Because I understood finally that reaching was not something she would ever do from her side. And I was too tired to keep covering the distance alone. I had been covering that distance for as long as I could remember, filling the silences, smoothing the edges, translating my mother's particular brand of observation into something I could accept without losing the thread of loving her. I was good at it. I had practiced it for 30 years, but you can only practice something for so long before the effort starts costing you more than the outcome is worth. I went home that night and I turned off my phone. 3 months passed. Not dramatically. That is the part people always misunderstand about this kind of silence. They imagine it as a sharp thing, an event, a door slamming. But it wasn't like that. It was more like a room slowly losing heat. You don't notice it at first. You pull on a sweater, then another, and then one day you realize you can see your breath. And you understand that the furnace has been out for a very long time. My mother did not call. My father did not call. I went to work. I did 12-hour shifts in the ICU, and I drove home, and I made dinner for one, and I called Dana on Sundays, and I paid my bills, and I ran the dishwasher, and I did all the ordinary things that constitute a life. The silence from my family was a presence in that life. The way an empty chair at a table is a presence. You don't stop noticing it. You just learn to set the table around it. The hardest part was not the big occasions. I had braced for those my birthday in March, which passed with a notification from a pizza chain, but nothing from anyone named Bellamy. Thanksgiving, which I spent with Dana and her husband in their apartment eating takeout Thai food because neither of us felt like cooking, and which was actually a very good evening, and which I felt obscurely guilty about enjoying as much as I did. Christmas, which I spent on a night shift, because the ICU does not observe holidays, and I had volunteered to cover, so that the nurses with children could stay home. I ate a piece of pie from the break room at 2 a.m. and watched the parking lot outside fill with a thin layer of snow and thought, this is fine. And it was. The hardest part was the ordinary Tuesdays, the Wednesday afternoons, the Saturday mornings when I was in the grocery store and I saw something, a brand of crackers my mother always kept in the pantry, a type of apple my father bought by the bag, and the seeing of it created a small, involuntary movement in my chest, some leftover reflex of connection that my nervous system hadn't gotten the memo about yet. Those were the moments that surprised me, not the holidays, the crackers. 6 months in, I called her. I don't know what I expected. I think some part of me, the part that had not yet finished learning what was true, wanted to hear something that would rearrange the evidence, a reasonable explanation, an acknowledgement, something. She answered on the third ring. Elise. Same tone as the doorbell. Familiar, slightly remote. Hi, Mom. I just wanted to check in. I'm actually in the middle of something right now. A pause. Brief. Businesslike. Can I call you back? She did not call back. The first year ended. I sent Christmas cards to my parents and to Amber. Because I am the kind of person who sends Christmas cards even when she doesn't want to. Because stopping felt like admitting something I wasn't ready to admit. I don't know if they received them. Nobody acknowledged them. In January, I got a card from my dentist, reminding me to schedule my cleaning. And for a moment, standing at the mailbox in the cold, I almost laughed. The second year was quieter than the first. I stopped waiting for the phone to ring. This sounds like progress, and in some ways it was, but in other ways it was just the body doing what bodies do, adjusting to a new normal, building scar tissue over what used to be an open place. I thought about my family less. I thought about the silence more. There's a difference. A colleague named Priya, who worked the same floor at Street, Vincent's, and who had become something like a friend in the particular way that people who share 12-hour shifts become friends quickly, out of necessity, durably asked me once that second year if I was going home for Easter. I told her I didn't really have a home to go to in that sense anymore. She looked at me with the careful expression of someone deciding how far to pursue a question. She decided not to pursue it. She just nodded and poured me a coffee, and we talked about something else, and I appreciated that more than I could have said. Some kindnesses are the shape of a question you didn't ask. I started visiting my grandfather. That was the beginning of the third part of those 37 months, and I will tell you about Calvin properly in a moment, but I need to tell you about the phone call first, because the phone call is the thing that changes the shape of everything that came before it. It is the thing that turned 37 months of what felt like misfortune into 37 months of what I now understand was a plan. I had been to see Calvin at Sunrise Pines on a Wednesday, his best day of the week, he always said, though I was never sure if he meant it or if he said it because it was the day I came. I was driving back through my parents' neighborhood because it was on the way, and I realized I had left a winter coat in the storage room of their house the last time I'd been there, which felt like a lifetime ago. It was a good coat. I didn't want to buy another one. I had a key still. The kind of key that accumulates in your life before you understand what it means to keep it. I let myself in through the side door and the house was quiet, and I thought they were out. My mother's voice came from the living room. She was on the phone. Her voice had the particular quality of someone speaking in a space they believed to be private, unhurried, precise. The words chosen not for effect but for accuracy. It was the voice she used when she was being honest. I had not heard it often. I stopped in the hallway. I have thought many times about whether I should have kept walking, whether I should have cleared my throat, or called out, or simply gone to the storage room and retrieved my coat and left the way I'd come. There is a version of that afternoon where I do those things, but I didn't, because something in her tone stopped me, something that sounded like the end of a conversation that had been going on for much longer than the phone call itself. If we keep Elise at a distance, she said, Dad won't feel the need to divide things evenly. He'll feel guilty about it. He'll leave it all to Amber. That's all we need. The hallway was very still. On the other end of the phone, my father's voice. Muffled, distant, but I knew the rhythm of it. You think it'll work? Frank said. It already is. My mother's voice carried something that was not quite satisfaction, but was close to it. The tone of someone watching a long calculation resolve correctly. She stopped reaching out. If we just hold the line a little longer, this will be done. I stood in the hallway of the house I had grown up in. I looked at the wallpaper on the left side of the hallway, the same wallpaper that had been there since I was 7 years old, a narrow stripe pattern in cream and dark green that I had always found faintly nautical. I had stared at that wallpaper through many difficult conversations in that house, many moments when I needed something still and constant to look at. It was still there. It was still striped. Everything else had rearranged itself around it. The storage room was 12 feet ahead of me on the left. My coat was in there, folded on a shelf above the old suitcases, exactly where I'd left it. I did not go get it. I went back out the side door. I drove home. I sat in my car in the parking lot of my building for 20 minutes without getting out. And during those 20 minutes, I did not cry, which surprised me because I had expected that if I ever learned something like this, I would cry. Instead, I felt something settle into place. Not a good feeling. Not the satisfaction of being right about a thing you'd hoped you were wrong about. Just a kind of cold clarity, the way a landscape looks different. After a hard frost, everything's still there, but stripped of whatever softness had been obscuring the actual structure of things. The distance had not been an accident. The silence was not the result of accumulated small hurts and missed connections, and the ordinary drift that sometimes happens between people who love each other imperfectly. It was a choice, made in a living room, spoken out loud into a phone. 3 years of nothing, 37 months of unreturned calls, and absent Christmas acknowledgments and birthdays that passed without a word had been a strategy. And the strategy had a target. And the target was a number, and the number was whatever Calvin Bellamy was worth. I thought about calling them. Standing in my car in that parking lot, I thought about calling them and saying what I knew, and I ran through the conversation in my head, the way you run through a conversation you're dreading, trying to find the version of it that produces something useful. There wasn't one. I knew what my mother would do. She would pivot. She would reframe. She would find a way to make the phone call my fault for listening, and my father would be quiet and nothing would change except that they would know I knew, and then they would be more careful. I needed them not to be careful, so I said nothing. I went inside. I heated water for tea I didn't drink. I stood at my kitchen window and looked at the parking lot below, and I thought about the wallpaper in that hallway, the cream and green stripes, the same for 26 years. And about how a house can hold something for decades without it becoming a secret, just an ordinary part of the walls, until the day you understand what was always in them. I set one bowl on the counter, the same as every other night, and I thought about my grandfather in room 14 of Sunrise Pines, who was waiting for me to come back on Wednesday, and who, I suspected, understood more about what was happening in this family than he had ever said out loud. I thought, if they want to play a long game, I can play a long game. I had learned patience in the ICU. I had learned to wait in the particular way, that waiting in medicine requires not passive, not resigned, but watchful. The kind of waiting where you are paying very close attention to everything and you are ready, when the moment arrives, to move without hesitation. I was ready. I just needed to understand one more thing first. I needed to understand Calvin. Calvin Bellamy was not an easy man to visit. He didn't fill silences. He didn't ask polite questions about your week, or tell stories about his past, the way some people do when they get old, as if their lives are something they've finally had time to sort through and catalog, ready to present to whoever is willing to sit still long enough. Calvin was not interested in presenting anything. He sat in his chair by the window of room 14 at Sunrise Pines, and he looked out at the parking lot below with the same expression he might have worn, looking at a complicated blueprint, attentive, not particularly impressed, waiting to see whether the structure would hold. The first time I came, he didn't ask why. This struck me, later, as the most generous thing he could have done, because I didn't have a clean answer. I had driven there from my apartment on a Tuesday evening in late October, 2 days after I had stood in my parents' hallway and heard the thing I'd heard, and I had not called ahead, and I had not thought through what I would say when I arrived. I just drove. The way you drive sometimes when you need to go somewhere, and your body picks the destination before your mind has had a chance to object. He was in his chair when the aide let me in. A chessboard on the small table beside him, mid-game, though I didn't see another player and I didn't ask. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "Pull up that chair." I pulled up the chair. We sat there for a while, and he looked at the parking lot, and I looked at my hands, and eventually he reached over and moved a chess piece. Then he looked at me and nodded at the board. I moved one in response, badly, and he studied the board and moved again. And that was how the first visit went. We played chess for an hour and a half. He won in 11 moves and then sat back and said nothing about it, which was its own kind of courtesy. When I stood to leave, he said, "Wednesday's better. After 2. So I came on Wednesdays after 2. I should tell you something about Calvin Bellamy, because he matters to this story in a way that is not only about what he left behind when he died. He was 79 years old, and he had been a residential architect for 40 years' houses, mostly the kind that people actually lived in, rather than the kind that appeared in magazines. He had a drafting table in his room that the facility let him keep, even though it took up more space than the rules technically allowed, and on it there was always a partially completed sketch of something. A floor plan, a staircase, a window placement. Not for any real project, just because his hands still knew how to do it and his mind still wanted to. He had married my grandmother when they were both 23. She had died 8 years before I started coming to see him. And he kept one photograph of her on the windowsill. Not a formal portrait, but a candid. Taken outdoors somewhere, her face turned slightly away from the camera, laughing at something off to the left. You could see from the angle that the person taking the photograph had been trying to get her to look at the lens and she had refused. Calvin had chosen that photograph from whatever albums existed. He had framed that one specifically. I thought about that sometimes, driving home on Wednesday evenings. The visit settled into a shape. I would bring something apple pie from the bakery on Clement Street, because he had mentioned once, in passing, that his wife used to make it, and I had written the detail down in my head without knowing why. He would accept it without ceremony, eat a piece, while we played chess, or while he watched me read, or while we sat in the kind of quiet that stops being uncomfortable once you've been inside it enough times to learn its texture. He did not say thank you often. He demonstrated it instead, in the small adjustments people make when they are glad someone is there, the way the chessboard would already be set up when I arrived, the way he would have the chair angled slightly toward the door, as if he had been watching for me. There were weeks when the Parkinson's was worse. His hands, which had spent 40 years holding pencils at precise angles, would shake when he lifted his coffee cup, and he had developed the habit of bracing his elbow against the armrest before he moved, a small compensation he had worked out for himself and never mentioned. On those days we didn't play chess. I would read something aloud, the newspaper, or a chapter of whatever book I'd brought, and he would listen with his eyes closed, and sometimes he would fall asleep, and sometimes he wouldn't. And I couldn't always tell the difference, and it didn't seem to matter. I came because he was there. He was awake because I came. That was enough of a structure. Once, early in the second year of my visits, I arrived to find him at the drafting table, the first time I'd seen him actually working at it, rather than simply occupying the same room as it. He was sketching something small, a series of quick lines that were resolving themselves into a staircase. His hands were steadier than usual that day. He heard me come in but didn't look up until he had finished the line he was drawing. "Sit down," he said. "I am almost done." I sat. He worked for another 10 minutes in silence. Then he set the pencil down and turned the chair to face me. "I designed 42 houses," he said, without preamble, the way he said most things. "I remember all of them. Not the clients. The houses." He paused. "The houses are still standing. The clients come and go." I didn't say anything. I had learned by then that he rarely offered something like that as an invitation for a response. He was more likely offering it as a starting point for something he was working through himself. "A house is the only thing you build," he continued, "where the people inside it change the thing more than you did. You draw the walls. They decide what the walls mean." He picked up the pencil again and turned it over in his fingers, the old draftsman's habit. That's either humbling or reassuring, depending on the day. He didn't say which kind of day it was. He went back to his sketch. I sat with what he'd said, and I thought about the wallpaper in my parents' hallway, and I didn't share any of that with him. But I think we both understood we were talking about the same thing. I noticed, in those first months, that no one else came. This is not entirely true. A facility like Sunrise Pines has staff who are skilled at the particular work of being present for people whose families are absent, and they were good at their jobs. There were activities on a board in the hallway. There were other residents on the floor. But from my grandfather's family, his son, his daughter-in-law, his younger granddaughter, there was nothing. Amber came once. I was told by the aide named Keisha, who had worked the morning shift for 3 years, and who had a plain-spoken directness I admired, and she'd brought flowers and taken a photograph and posted it somewhere online, and not returned. This was in the first year of the 37 months. After that, nothing. "Your grandfather always knows it's Wednesday," Keisha told me one afternoon, straightening the blanket on the end of Calvin's bed while he and I played chess. "He starts looking at the clock around 1:30. She said it the way a person says something they've decided you should know, without making it into a statement about anyone who wasn't there. I didn't respond. I moved my bishop. Calvin took it immediately. My grandfather never mentioned the absences. Not once, in all the Wednesdays we sat together, did he say anything about my parents, or Amber, or the general shape of what had happened to his family. He was not the kind of man who spoke about things he had already made a decision about. But there were moments, small ones, the kind that accumulate into something larger only when you look back at them from a distance. He asked me once, without preamble, whether I owned my apartment or rented, and when I told him I rented, he nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd already calculated. He asked me, on a different occasion, what I would do with a house if I had one, not a hypothetical investment property, but a specific question. A real house, what would I actually do with it? I told him I would fix the kitchen first. He nodded again. He didn't explain why he'd asked. Another time, I arrived to find him with a legal pad on the drafting table, writing something in his careful architect's handwriting, and he closed the pad when I came in. Not quickly, not guiltily, just the way you close a notebook when you're done with a thought and it doesn't need an audience. I didn't ask what it was. I understand now what it was. The last real conversation I had with Calvin was 6 weeks before he died. He had been declining. The Parkinson's was moving faster than the previous year, and his heart was doing things that the doctors were watching carefully and explaining with measured optimism, which is the medical community's particular way of saying they cannot promise anything. I sat with him for 3 hours that Wednesday. We didn't play chess. We didn't really talk much either. I read a section of a book I'd brought while he looked out the window, and at some point the afternoon light shifted and the room went a different color, and he turned from the window and looked at me for a long moment. "You know what your parents did," he said. It wasn't a question. I put the book down. I looked at him. "Yes," I said. He held my gaze for a moment longer. Then he looked back at the window. "I know too," he said. "I've known for a long time." A pause. The particular pause of a man who has had a conversation going in his head for months and is now deciding how much of it to speak aloud. "You remind me that not everyone in this family forgot how to be decent. That was all." He did not say anything else about it. He did not name them. He did not explain what he meant by forgot, though I understood exactly what he meant by it. He did not tell me what he was going to do, and I did not ask, because there was something about the way he said it that was complete in itself, not a beginning, not a promise, just an observation. The kind of thing you say when you want someone to know that you saw them, that you saw what was real and you remembered it, even when other people chose not to. I drove home that night and I sat in my car again in the parking lot, but this time I didn't sit for 20 minutes. I sat for 5, and then I went inside and I made dinner, and I got up the next morning and went to work, because that is what you do when someone has given you something that doesn't require a response. You carry it carefully and you keep going. He died on a Thursday night, 6 weeks later. It was Keisha who called me. She had my number because I was listed as the emergency contact. I want to be precise about that. I was listed as Calvin Bellamy's emergency contact, not my father, who was his son, not my mother, who had been his daughter-in-law for 35 years, not Amber, who had brought flowers once and taken a photograph. Calvin had filled out a form at some point in the past, I don't know when, I don't know what was in his head when he did it, and he had written my name in the box that asked who to call. Keisha's voice was gentle. She told me it had been peaceful. She told me he had not been alone, that someone from the night staff had been with him. She said she was sorry. I thanked her and I sat in the dark of my bedroom for a while, and I thought about a chessboard set up and waiting by a chair near a window, and a photograph of a woman laughing at something off to the left, and the question of what I would do with a house if I had one. I would fix the kitchen first. I still meant that. And then, 3 weeks after my grandfather died, on a Saturday afternoon in October, when I had just come off a 12-hour shift and was standing at my kitchen counter heating up soup, my doorbell rang, and I walked to the door and I looked through the peephole, and I saw my mother standing in the hallway with her canvas tote bag and her Thanksgiving smile, and I counted to 10, and I opened the door. You already know what she asked for. Now I need to tell you what happened next. Part 4. One question. I came back to the living room with my water glass, and I sat down across from my mother. She had been talking while I was in the kitchen. I caught the tail end of it, something about how Amber had worked so hard this year, how she was finally coming into her own, how this birthday could be the kind of thing a person looks back on as a turning point. Patricia Bellamy was very good at constructing a narrative around whatever she needed. It was one of her genuine gifts. She could make a request sound like an opportunity. She could make an extraction sound like a gift. My father had not moved from the armchair. He was looking at the window. Outside, the afternoon was getting thinner. I set my water glass on the coffee table and I looked at my mother. She was still talking. The number had already been said, $50,000. but she had moved past it now into the surrounding architecture of the ask, the scaffolding of reasons designed to make the number seem reasonable, even natural. I listened to her build it. I was very calm. I want to be clear about that, because I think people expect this kind of moment to come with heat, with shaking hands or a raised voice or the particular electricity that arrives when something finally breaks open. It wasn't like that. The calm I felt was the kind that comes after a long illness when the fever finally breaks. Not the absence of something, but the presence of clarity. My temperature was normal. I could see the room very precisely. I noticed things I wouldn't have noticed otherwise. The small gold clasp on my mother's tote bag, slightly tarnished on one side. The way my father's left hand was resting open on the armrest, palm up, the fingers loosely curled, not a relaxed hand, but a hand that had given up holding something. The particular quality of the late afternoon light coming through my window, the kind of October light that makes everything look like it's been lit from slightly behind. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. I glanced down at it. A notification from Instagram, which I had not opened in some time, but had not deleted either. I don't know what made me look at it in that moment. Reflex, probably, or the particular restlessness of a person sitting very still. It was a post from Amber. I picked up the phone. In the photograph, my sister was standing beside a white car in a parking garage, one hand on the roof, grinning at the camera with the unguarded pleasure of someone who has never had to wonder where good things come from. The car was new. I could tell from the way the light hit it that it had not been driven much. In the caption, she had written about the vacation she'd just returned from Cancun, a week at a resort she named in the caption without irony, and below that, a photograph of a living room in an apartment I didn't recognize, with a wall of windows looking out over a city skyline. New apartment. Below that, the words that my mother was still speaking somewhere at the edge of my hearing, blessed by the best parents ever. Couldn't do any of this without them. The timestamp read, "Hours ago. Ow. 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 Ow." 3 hours ago, while my parents were driving to my apartment, I put the phone down on the coffee table. Face up, screen facing the ceiling, perfectly visible to anyone seated across from me. I did not point at it. I did not say anything about it. I simply put it down, the way you set down a document you've finished reading. My mother stopped talking. It was not a dramatic stop. It was the stop of someone who has registered a change in the room, a shift in temperature or light, and is recalibrating. Her eyes dropped to the phone. She looked at the screen for a moment. Then she looked up at me. Frank turned from the window. He had heard the silence. He looked at the phone. The three of us sat in the particular quiet of people who now know the same thing. $50,000. Not for a birthday party. Not for a celebration. For a car that was already bought. An apartment that was already leased. A vacation that was already over. The money they had come to ask me for was not future money. It was the accounting for things that had already happened. And the things that had already happened were in a photograph my sister had posted 3 hours ago, without knowing anyone was sitting in her older sister's living room asking for it. I looked at my mother. "Did you know," I said, "that I heard that phone call?" She went very still. "The one you made to Dad." I kept my voice exactly where it was. Level, unhurried. The voice I use in the ICU when I am explaining something important to a family member who does not want to hear it but needs to, about keeping me at a distance, about Grandpa's will, about Amber. I paused. I was in the hallway. I had come to get my coat. You didn't know I was there. The room was quiet. Outside, the same sounds as before: parking lot, traffic, a dog somewhere below going through its last round of the day. The ordinary world continuing. My mother opened her mouth. She closed it. Frank was looking at his hands. He had folded them in his lap at some point without me noticing, and he was looking at them as if they were something he'd been asked to hold and wasn't sure he wanted. I thought about all the moments in my life when I had waited for my father to say something to weigh in, to take a position, to be that esme that ecstated beyond physical occupation of a chair. This was another one of those moments. He looked at his hands. He said nothing. My mother's face moved through several things quickly. I watched it happen. The first was a flash of something that might have been, in a different person, shame, but in her, it resolved almost immediately into the next thing, which was calculation. She was looking for the pivot. I could see her looking for it, the way you can see someone scanning a room for an exit. She was trying to find the version of this moment that she could reshape, the framing that would make what I'd said into something other than what it was. There wasn't one. She knew it. The phone was on the table. I waited. I was not waiting for an apology. I had not been waiting for one for some time. I was waiting because I had asked a question, and the asking of it was enough, because the question itself had done what I needed it to do, which was to let her know exactly what I knew, and to let her know I had known it for 2 years, and to let her see what that meant now. In this room, with the phone on the table between us and the photograph of my sister's new car still on the screen, Patricia Bellamy was a woman who had spent her life making things make sense. Not in the way that honest people make sense of things by acknowledging what is true and working from there, but in the way that skilled reframers do, by constructing an alternative explanation that fits all the same facts into a different shape. I had watched her do it my whole life. She was very good at it. It was how she had explained away the wedding comment. It was how she had explained away the unreturned phone call. It was how she had, presumably, explained away 37 months of deliberate silence to herself every day she went about her life. She was trying to do it now. I could see it. The small movements of her face as the machinery of it engaged, looking for the pivot, the reframe, the version of this moment that she could offer me, that would require me to accept a different meaning. There wasn't one. The phone was on the table. Amber's photograph was on the phone. My question was in the air, and whatever my mother found when she looked for the reframe, she could not find a way to offer it to me that I would have accepted, and some part of her knew that, and that was what changed her face. Not guilt, not remorse. Something smaller and more honest. Recognition. The recognition of a person who has been outmaneuvered not through cleverness, but through patience, which is a different thing entirely, and harder to defend against, because there is no countermove. You cannot outweight someone who has already waited. She stood up. "We should go," she said. Her voice was very steady. I will give her that. She stood up, and she picked up her canvas tote bag, and she arranged the strap on her shoulder, and she looked at me for one moment, not long, not meeting my eyes fully, but looking in my direction, and then she walked to the door. Frank stood. He looked at me once. A long moment, and in it I thought I saw something that was not quite an apology, but was adjacent to one, the expression of a man who has known for a long time that he was on the wrong side of something, and has never found the words or the will to cross over. He didn't find them now either. He followed her. The door opened. The door closed. The sound of it was not dramatic. Doors in apartment buildings close with a kind of mechanical certainty, the latch engaging, the lock clicking into place. Ordinary, final. I sat in my living room. The phone was still on the table, screen dimming now, the photograph fading as the display timed out. I watched it go dark. I did not pick it up. I did not move for a while. I sat there in the quiet of the apartment, which was the same quiet it always was. The quiet of a space built for one person, and I let it settle around me. At some point, I got up and went to the kitchen and looked at the soup I had never eaten. It had gone cold on the stove. I turned the burner back on and stood there while it came back to temperature. And I thought about room 14 at Sunrise Pines and a chessboard set up by a window and a man who had written one name on a form. Mine. I thought about the legal pad he had closed when I walked in. The architect's handwriting on the page. That evening, around 9 o'clock, My phone lit up with a text from a number I recognized as Amber's. It said, "I just saw what Mom posted today. I had no idea they were going to ask you for that. I'm sorry." I read it. I set the phone face down on the nightstand. I didn't answer that night. There are things that take time to know how to respond to. That was one of them, I thought. I will know soon enough what the legal pad said. And I was right. But that is the last part of this story. And before I tell it to you, I need you to sit with this for a moment, with the image of two people walking out of my apartment and the quiet they left behind. Because the quiet was not empty. It was the first time in 37 months that I had been alone in a room and felt, entirely and without reservation, that the room was mine. Some things take a long time to become true. That one had been becoming true for 3 years. It was true now. The law office of Gerald Marsh was on the 4th floor of a building downtown that had the particular quality of spaces designed to discourage lingering low ceilings, chairs that were comfortable enough to sit in for an hour but no more, neutral art on the walls that asked nothing of you and gave nothing back. The carpet was gray. The reception desk was staffed by a woman who offered water in a tone that made clear the offer was procedural. I arrived 7 minutes early. My parents were already there. We did not speak in the waiting room. We did not acknowledge each other beyond the brief, involuntary eye contact that happens when people who know each other well enter the same space. My mother was wearing the blue dress again, the same one from Dana's wedding, which was either a coincidence or wasn't. And I found I didn't particularly care which. My father sat beside her with his hands folded in his lap, the same posture as the armchair in my living room 3 weeks earlier. Amber arrived 2 minutes after me, a little breathless, wearing a jacket she'd clearly put on in a hurry. She looked at me when she came in and her face did something complicated. I gave her a small nod. She sat down across from our parents and did not look at her phone, which I suspected cost her something. Gerald Marsh was a compact man in his 60s who had clearly read the room before entering it, because he came in without preamble, thanked us all for coming, and set a folder on the table with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times and understood that efficiency was a form of mercy. Calvin Bellamy's estate, he said, is straightforward in its instructions. He updated this document 14 months ago and was very clear about his intentions. He opened the folder. He looked down at it for a moment. A brief pause that I understood later was not hesitation but consideration. The pause of a man who had read a document several times and was deciding the most humane order in which to present its contents. He read the standard language first. The property at 14 Birch Lane, Carver Falls. The savings account. The personal possessions, including the drafting table and all materials associated with it. The small investment account that Calvin had built quietly over 40 years. The way careful people build things without announcing it, without drama, with the patience of someone who understood that the point was not the building, but what you did with what you'd built. Then he reached the distribution section. All remaining assets, he read, are to be left in their entirety to my granddaughter, Elise Ann Bellamy. No further divisions are specified. 1 sentence. 11 words after the name. The room was very quiet. My mother exhaled. It was not a sob, not a gasp, not anything with enough shape to be called a reaction. It was just air leaving her body, the particular sound of a person releasing something they had been holding for a long time and had just been told they would not get to keep. I had heard that sound before, in the ICU, at the end of long nights, from families who had been waiting for a different answer. It was not a sound I had ever expected to hear from her, and hearing it did not give me what I might have thought it would give me. It gave me nothing, actually. It was just a sound. Frank did not make a sound. He looked at the table. Amber looked at me. Her expression was the one I had been thinking about since her text message 3 weeks ago. The expression of someone who is trying to understand a situation that has been going on for longer than she knew, and that she had been, without her knowledge or consent, a prop in. She was not a villain in this story. I had understood that for some time. She was someone who had been handed things and had taken them without asking where they came from, the way people do when they are young, and the people who love them seem to have everything under control. The understanding of what that had cost was arriving on her face in real time, and I watched it arrive, and I did not look away, because I thought she deserved to have someone witness that. Gerald Marsh answered the questions that followed with the practiced equanimity of a man who had seen this scene in many variations. Yes, the document was legally sound. Yes, it had been updated within the past 2 years. No, there were no provisions for contest. He said these things gently but without hedging, which was the right approach. And then he gave us each a copy of the relevant sections and told us his office would be in touch regarding the practical steps. We filed out of the conference room in the order we had filed in, except that Amber stopped in the hallway and waited for me while our parents continued toward the elevator. She stood there with the slightly desperate air of someone who has something to say and isn't sure they have the right to say it. I really didn't know, she said, about any of it. The plan, the eye, didn't know what they were doing. I looked at her. She was 27 years old, and she was telling the truth, which I believed, and which did not resolve everything, but resolved something. I know, I said. The text I sent, she started. I got it, she nodded. She seemed to be waiting for more. I didn't have more to give her yet, and I thought the honest thing was to not pretend otherwise. Give me some time, I said. She nodded again. And there was something in the way she did it not resigned, not hurt, just accepting that made me think she might be. In some ways, I hadn't seen yet more capable of this kind of honesty than I had given her credit for. She had been shaped by what our parents gave her the same way I had been shaped by what they withheld. Neither of us had chosen that. What we did with it from here was the only part that was actually ours. I walked to the elevator. I pressed the button. I rode down alone. I drove to 14 Birch Lane that afternoon. I had never been inside. Calvin had lived there for 30 years, through my grandmother's life and the years after it. And in all the times I had visited Sunrise Pines, I had never thought to ask him what the house looked like or whether I might see it someday. I had his key now, along with a folder of paperwork from Gerald Marsh's office, and I sat in the car in front of it for a while before going in. It was a small house on a street with other small houses, the kind of street where the lots are modest and the trees are old, where you can tell by the proportions of the houses that they were built in a time when people assumed they would know their neighbors. The house itself was white with dark green shutters. There was a front porch with 2 chairs on it, both a little weathered. The lawn had been kept up by someone from the facility, I supposed, or by a neighbor. It looked tended. I went up the porch steps and unlocked the door. Inside smelled like him. Old paper and something faintly mineral, the smell of drafting pencils, and the particular cleanliness of a person who keeps their space organized not for company but for themselves. The living room was small and exact nothing unnecessary. Everything placed with the care of someone who had thought about where things belonged and put them there. On the shelf beside the window, 3 architecture books, a dictionary, and a framed photograph I recognized. My grandmother, face turned away, laughing at something off to the left. I stood in front of it for a moment. Then I went to find the kitchen. It was at the back of the house, looking out over a small yard with a garden that was mostly dormant at this time of year. The kitchen was clean and simply done, with older appliances and counters that had been replaced at some point with a light wood that was unpretentious and warm. There was a window above the sink that caught the afternoon light in a way that made the room feel larger than it was. I stood in the middle of it. I thought about the question Calvin had asked me 18 months ago, about what I would do with a house if I had one. I would fix the kitchen first. That is what I had said. But standing in it now, looking at the light coming through the window above the sink, I thought, there is nothing to fix. He had already done that. He had stood in this room for 30 years with this window and this light, and what he had built here quietly, without announcing it was not in need of repair. It was in need of someone to keep living in it. To set more than one bowl on the counter. To make apple pie badly, and learn the particular way this oven ran hot. To sit at the table by the window in the morning with coffee, the way he must have done, and watch the garden come back in April. I pulled out one of the kitchen chairs and sat down. Outside, the yard was still and gray in the October afternoon. The garden beds were put to rest for the winter, the way good gardens are not abandoned, but resting, holding their shape, ready. I thought about 37 months of silence. I thought about a hallway with cream and green wallpaper and a coat I never got back. I thought about Wednesdays after 2 o'clock and a chessboard and a man who demonstrated gratitude by having the chair facing the door. I thought about my mother's exhale in that conference room, and I waited for something to arrive with it: anger, or satisfaction, or the clean feeling I had read about in stories where justice is served, and the right person wins, and everything resolves into clarity. None of those things came. What came instead was simpler and harder to name. It was the feeling of a person who has been walking for a very long time and has arrived somewhere, and is not yet sure what to do with the stillness, but is beginning to understand that the stillness is the point, that this is what it was supposed to feel like. Not triumph, just solidity, just ground. I do not know if I will forgive my parents. I have thought about it the way you think about a surgery you might need, with the knowledge that it would probably be better for you in the long run, and with the uncertainty of someone who is not yet ready to schedule it. I know that forgiveness, if it comes, will not be for them. I know that it will be a thing I do for the same reason I fixed my own kitchen first. Not because the appliances need replacing, but because I am the one who lives there, and I want the room to be mine. Amber and I have been talking. Slowly, in the particular way that people talk when they are rebuilding something from a foundation rather than a memory, carefully, with attention to what will hold weight. She asked me last week if she could come to see the house. I said yes. I am not sure what we will be to each other yet. I am not sure we know, but she came home from Cancun, and she looked at her bank statements, and she asked our parents some questions she should have asked years ago, and she is working some things out. That is all I know. It is, for now, enough. The afternoon light shifted in the kitchen. Outside, a bird landed in one of the dormant garden beds and regarded the ground with great seriousness and then flew away. I stayed a while longer. Then I got up and I locked the door behind me, and I drove home to my apartment, which was small and quiet and mine, and I made dinner in it, and I set one bowl on the counter, and then I thought about it for a moment and got out a second one, because there was pie left over from the bakery on Clement Street, and it seemed like the right kind of evening for it. What do you think it costs to forgive someone who has never asked for it? Not for them, but for you. I've been sitting with that question in this kitchen for a while now. If you've ever had to answer it yourself, I'd really like to know what you found. I'll be reading every one. Here is what I want you to take from this story. When someone removes themselves from your life without explanation, your first instinct is to assume you did something wrong. You replay every conversation, every moment, looking for the thing you broke. But sometimes the silence has nothing to do with who you are. Sometimes it is a strategy, and you are simply the piece being moved off the board. The people who genuinely love you don't disappear when something more valuable comes along. They stay. They show up on Wednesdays. They write your name on a form when no one is watching. That is what loyalty actually looks like, not grand gestures, but consistent presence when there is nothing to gain from it. If someone in your life has gone quiet on you, ask yourself honestly, have they ever shown up when it cost them something? And if you're the one who drifted,